They made him stand outside like a man without a name, boots half buried in red dust, the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the wooden porch behind him. And if you listened close, you could hear the quiet laughter slipping through the saloon doors like smoke under a crack. Caleb Ward didn't argue, didn't knock, didn't even look back when someone inside said he wasn't worth the whiskey he couldn't afford. He just stood there with his hat in his hands, turning it once, slow, like it meant more than anything else he owned. The leather worn soft from years of weather and miles, and tucked inside the band, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a single eagle feather, faded at the edges but still holding its shape like it remembered something the world had forgotten. A boy passing by stopped and stared at him, squinting up through the light. "Mister, you waiting on someone?" And Caleb glanced down, just once, eyes steady but tired in a way that didn't come from lack of sleep. "No," he said, voice low as dry wind. "Just passing through." The boy hesitated like he wanted to ask more. Then his mother called him from across the street, and he ran, leaving Caleb alone again with the heat, the dust, and the kind of silence that only shows up when a man chooses not to fill it. Inside, a chair scraped. A burst of laughter followed, and someone pushed the door open just enough to toss out a glance that measured him and found nothing worth remembering. "You ain't coming in," the man said, not unkind, just certain, like stating the weather, and Caleb nodded once, slow, as if he already knew, because men like him always knew, not from what was said, but from what wasn't. The wind shifted then, carrying the scent of horses before the sound, and it came low at first, like a distant drumbeat under the earth, hooves striking hard ground somewhere beyond the ridge, steady, deliberate, not rushed, not wandering, and the few people on the street felt it. Before they heard it, heads turning one by one, conversations thinning, hands pausing mid-motion as the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Caleb didn't turn right away, just closed his fingers around the brim of his hat a little tighter, thumb brushing the edge of that hidden feather, as if grounding himself in something older than this town, older than the stairs, older than the quiet judgment that clung to him like dust. The sound grew clearer, closer, a rhythm that didn't belong to cattle or traders, something more organized, more certain, and the first rider appeared at the far end of the street, then another, until the line stretched long enough to make the whole town feel smaller. Apache warriors moving through the heat like a single thought, faces calm, eyes forward, not searching, not threatening, just present in a way that made every other man step back without being told. Someone inside the saloon muttered a curse, another reached for the doorframe like it might steady him, and the sheriff across the street straightened, hand hovering near his belt but not quite touching, because even he knew this wasn't a moment you rushed into. Caleb finally lifted his gaze then, slow, measured, watching the riders approach. Without stepping away, without lifting his chin, just standing where they had left him, a nobody in the middle of a road that suddenly mattered more than it had a minute ago. And as the riders drew closer, dust curling around their horses' legs, the last man came into view, riding a half-length behind the others, older, still, carrying something in the way he held himself that didn't need introduction. And when his eyes moved across the street, past the buildings, past the people who suddenly had no words left, they didn't stop on the sheriff, or the saloon, or the men who had been laughing just moments before. They stopped on the man standing alone with a worn hat in his hands, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, quiet as breath, heavy as memory, and no one in that town yet understood why the air had just changed. The horses came to a stop without a word being spoken, dust settling slow around their legs like the earth itself was trying not to interrupt, and every man in that street seemed to shrink just a little, as if space had shifted and they no longer belonged in it. The Apache riders did not reach for anything, did not raise their voices. They simply waited, and waiting like that carried more weight than shouting ever could, the kind of silence that made a man think twice about the ground beneath his boots. The sheriff cleared his throat, a dry sound that went nowhere. "State your business," he called, trying to hold something steady in his voice. But it cracked just enough to be heard, and the riders did not answer him, not one of them, because their attention was somewhere else entirely. Caleb felt it before he fully understood it, that quiet pressure of being seen without being judged, his fingers still resting along the brim of his hat, thumb brushing that hidden feather again, a habit he did not even know he had, like checking that something important had not slipped away. The chief swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, boots hitting the dirt soft but certain, and when he straightened, the space around him seemed to settle into place, like the world had been waiting for him to stand there, tall, still, older than the rest, his hair touched with gray, his presence carrying something deeper than authority, something earned in ways no one here could name. He took a step forward, then another, not toward the saloon, not toward the sheriff, but toward the man standing alone in the middle of it all, and that was when the whispers started, low and confused. "What is he doing?" someone muttered. "Why him?" Another voice followed, thinner, unsure, and the man who had refused Caleb entry just minutes ago leaned halfway out the door, eyes narrowing as if trying to force meaning into something that did not fit his understanding. Caleb did not move, not forward, not back, just watched, calm in a way that did not belong to someone facing a line of riders. But then again, nothing about him seemed to belong to what people expected. The chief slowed as he approached, his gaze dropping briefly to the hat in Caleb's hands. And for a moment, something almost like recognition flickered there, gone as quickly as it came, but not before it left a trace in the air, a shift too subtle for most to notice, but enough to change the way the wind felt against the skin. "You." The sheriff tried again, louder now, stepping forward 2 paces as if reclaiming control, but the word hung useless between them, because it was not meant for him, never had been. The riders behind the chief remained mounted, still as carved stone, their eyes forward but aware, forming a quiet wall that said more than any threat could, and the town, with all its noise and certainty, found itself held in place by something it did not understand. Caleb lifted his eyes fully now, meeting the chief's gaze without challenge, without submission, just presence, and for a second that stretched longer than it should have, the 2 men stood like that, connected by something invisible, something older than the dust, older than the road, older than the names people used to measure each other. A breeze slipped through, catching the edge of Caleb's hat, just enough to reveal the feather inside, and the chief's eyes settled there, not moving, not blinking, as if that small detail carried more truth than anything else in sight, and the murmur behind them faded into nothing at all, because whatever was about to happen did not belong to the crowd, did not belong to the town, it belonged to that single moment, balanced on something no one else could see, and no one there was ready for what it meant. The chief stopped just a few feet from Caleb, close enough that the dust between them had nowhere left to settle, and for a moment, neither man spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have made it smaller, would have taken something that belonged to silence and forced it into shapes it did not need. The town held its breath again, tighter this time, like everyone understood that whatever came next would not be undone. And the man in the doorway, the one who had turned Caleb away, shifted his weight, suddenly unsure where to look, his confidence slipping through his fingers like dry sand. Caleb's hand moved slightly along the brim of his hat, not lifting it, just steadying it, his thumb brushing that feather again as if it carried a memory he did not speak about, something he kept close not for others to see, but so he would not forget. The chief's gaze did not leave that small detail, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, each word placed carefully. "You kept it," he said, not a question, not quite a statement, something in between, like he already knew the answer but needed to hear the sound of it. In the air, Caleb's eyes flickered once, not with surprise, but with recognition of something long buried rising just enough to be felt again. "It was not mine to lose," he replied, simple, steady, and that was all. No explanation, no story offered, just a truth laid bare in a way that did not ask to be understood. A ripple moved through the riders behind the chief, subtle but real, like a wind passing through tall grass, and one of them lowered his gaze for a brief second, a gesture so small. Most would have missed it, but not the ones who knew what it meant. The sheriff took another step forward, drawn by a need to reclaim ground that no longer belonged to him. "If there is business, it will be handled proper," he said, voice louder now, forcing its way into a moment that did not welcome it. But the chief did not turn, did not acknowledge him. Because the conversation unfolding here had nothing to do with law or town or authority built from paper and walls. It belonged to something older, something carried in memory and action rather than words. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing deeper into the dust, and for the first time since the riders arrived, he lifted his chin just enough to meet the chief's eyes fully, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. And in that quiet exchange, there was no crowd, no saloon, no sheriff. Just two men standing on opposite sides of a line that had been drawn long before either of them had a say in it. The wind caught. Again, a little stronger this time, lifting the edge of Caleb's coat, stirring the feather inside the hat so it showed itself clearly now, not hidden anymore. The worn quill catching the light for a brief second, and the chief's expression changed, not in a way that could be easily named, but enough that those closest to him straightened without thinking, as if something important had just been confirmed. Many seasons, the chief said quietly, more to the air than to Caleb. Many men forget what is given to them, and Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly. The smallest shift. Some things are not given, he answered. They are trusted, and the words settled between them with a weight that pressed outward, touching everything, even those who did not understand them. Behind them, the murmurs had stopped entirely now, replaced by a stillness that felt almost heavy, like the town itself was listening, trying to piece together a story that no one had told them. And the man in the doorway slowly removed his hand from the frame, as if realizing he had been holding on to something that was no longer his to hold. The chief took one final step closer, close enough now that there was no space left for doubt, his eyes steady, searching not for proof, but for confirmation of something already known. And Caleb did not look away, did not lower his gaze, did not move at all, because whatever this moment was, it had already decided itself long before either of them arrived here, and all that remained was for the world around them to catch up. The distance between them disappeared without either man moving, like the space itself had decided it no longer belonged there, and the chief's eyes softened just enough to carry something deeper than authority, something closer to memory. And when he spoke again, his voice carried quieter now, almost like it was meant only for Caleb. The river was high that day, he said, and a few heads in the crowd tilted, confused, searching for meaning in words that sounded like nothing more than weather. But Caleb did not look confused. His gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward, like he could see something none of them could, something far from this dusty street. The sound of water seemed to rise in the silence, not real, not present, but remembered, and Caleb's fingers tightened just once around the hat, pressing that feather deeper into the band, as if holding onto it kept something steady. It was rising fast, he answered, his voice low, steady, but carrying weight now. And the chief nodded once, slow, like two men speaking across years instead of feet. The crowd stirred, uncertain, because the tension they had expected had not come. No raised voices, no sudden movement, just this quiet exchange that felt heavier than anything louder ever could. And the sheriff lowered his hand slightly from his belt, not by choice, but because something in him understood that whatever authority he held did not reach into this moment. The chief took a breath, slow, measured, then reached up. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a simple movement, his hand lifting toward the brim of his own hat, and everything in that street seemed to freeze, because even those who did not understand what it meant could feel that it mattered. Caleb did not react, not outwardly, just watched, still as the ground beneath him. And when the chief removed his hat, holding it at his side, his head lowered just slightly. The shift was so quiet it almost went unnoticed, but it spread through the space like a ripple through still water. And the men behind him straightened, some lowering their gaze, others placing a hand over their chest, small gestures. But together they carried a meaning no one in that town had ever been taught to read. A woman standing near the well drew in a breath she did not release. The man in the saloon doorway stepped back without realizing it, and the boy from earlier, now standing beside his mother, whispered, "Why did he do that?" But she had no answer, because this was not something their world explained. The chief lifted his eyes again, still holding his hat low, and spoke. "You carried him when the current tried to take him." And there it was, not a full story, not a long explanation, Just a single thread pulled from something much larger, enough to change everything without saying everything. Caleb's jaw shifted slightly, a memory settling into place behind his eyes. He would have done the same, he replied, simple, as if that was the only truth worth saying, and the chief's expression softened further, not into a smile, but into something that carried respect without needing to show it. The silence that followed was different now, no longer tense, no longer waiting, but full, like something had been set right without anyone having to declare it. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the weight that had pressed on the town began to shift, not lifting completely, but enough for people to feel that what they had seen could not be undone, could not be forgotten. The chief placed his hat back on his head with the same calm motion, then stepped back once, giving space not because he needed it, but because it belonged there again, and Caleb, after a moment, lifted his own hat just enough to settle it back into place, the feather hidden once more, not for secrecy, but because it had already been seen by the one who needed to see it. No one spoke, not the sheriff, not the men in the saloon, not even the wind seemed willing to break what had just been established, and as the chief turned slightly, preparing to return to his horse, the town stood in that silence, understanding something they had never been taught, that a man's worth was not decided by the voices around him, but by the quiet moments someone else remembered. The moment should have ended there, clean and complete, like a door closing on something settled, but it did not, because truth, once seen, does not leave quietly. It lingers in the spaces people thought they understood, and the town felt it, pressing in from all sides, changing the weight of every glance, every breath. The chief turned slightly, just enough to signal the riders behind him, and one by one, they shifted their horses, not in retreat, not in urgency, just a calm readiness, like men who had come for a reason and found it. And that alone unsettled the crowd more than any show of force could have, because there was nothing left to argue against, nothing left to fear in the way they expected. Caleb remained where he was, hat settled back on his head now, the feather hidden again, his posture unchanged, but something in the air around him had shifted, not in him, but in how the world stood next to him, like the ground itself had decided to hold him differently. The man at the saloon door stepped fully outside now, slower than before, his earlier certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier, and he looked at Caleb not like a stranger anymore, but like a man trying to remember a face he should have known all along. "You could have said something," he muttered, not accusing, not apologizing, just stating what now felt like a mistake, and Caleb did not turn toward him, did not answer right away, because some things, once spoken, could not be taken back into silence. Would it have mattered? Caleb said finally, voice low, steady, and the man had no answer, because the truth was already sitting in the dust between them, plain and undeniable. The sheriff shifted his stance again, his authority now something he carried out of habit rather than belief, and he cleared his throat once more, softer this time. "You are welcome in this town," he said, but even as the words left him, they felt late, like rain after the ground had already cracked, and Caleb gave the smallest nod, not in acceptance, not in rejection, just acknowledgement, because respect offered after the moment had passed did not weigh the same. The chief paused near his horse, one hand resting lightly on the saddle, and he glanced back once, not to check, not to question, but to mark the moment in a way that did not need to be spoken, and Caleb met that look with the same quiet steadiness, a brief connection that held no demand, no expectation, just understanding. The boy from earlier stepped a little closer now, curiosity stronger than fear, his small boots kicking dust as he stopped a few feet away, looking up at Caleb with wide eyes. "Mister," he said, hesitant but honest, "why did he do that for you?" And this time, Caleb did look down, not with distance, but with something softer, something that belonged to a different part of him. He remembered, Caleb answered, simple as that, and the boy frowned slightly, trying to fit those words into a world that had always explained things louder, clearer, but somehow less true. The riders began to turn, hooves shifting, leather creaking softly, and the line that had once filled the streets started to move again, not with drama, not with urgency, just leaving the way they had come, quiet, certain, as if The land itself had called them back. The town watched them go, not speaking, not moving, because what had happened could not be undone by noise. And even the wind seemed to carry it forward, spreading it across the empty space they left behind. Caleb adjusted his hat once more, a small motion, almost nothing, but it settled him in place like a man who knew exactly where he stood, and without another word, he stepped forward, past the saloon, past the eyes that no longer looked at him the same. Boots finding their rhythm again on the dry ground. Behind him, the man at the door watched in silence. The sheriff lowered his gaze, and the boy stood still, holding on to a question that would take him years to understand, because out here, a man did not become someone when others said his name. He became someone the moment another man chose to remember it. Caleb did not look back as he walked, not because he was unaware of the eyes following him, but because he had learned long ago that some moments were not meant to be carried any further than the ground where they happened, and each step he took seemed to pull the town back into its old shape, but not quite the same, like a place that had shifted just enough that it could never fully return. The boards of the saloon creaked behind him as the door opened wider than before. No hesitation this time, no voice stopping him, just space being offered where it had once been denied, and the man who had stood in that doorway cleared his throat again, softer now. "You can come in," he said, but the words hung in the air without reaching Caleb, because the invitation, though honest, had arrived after something more important had already passed. Caleb slowed just slightly, not stopping, not turning, just enough to show he had heard, and his hand moved once to the brim of his hat, adjusting it against the sun that had begun its slow drop toward the horizon, casting everything in a softer light that took the edge off the dust and the hard lines of the buildings. The street behind him remained quiet longer than it should have, longer than any town used to noise could tolerate, but no one rushed to fill it, because each person there was holding on to something they did not yet know how to name. The sheriff stepped down from his place, boots hitting the dirt with less weight than before, his hand no longer near his belt, and he watched Caleb's back as if trying to measure a man he had misjudged, not by appearance now, but by something that did not show itself easily, something that had to be earned in silence. The boy broke from his mother's side and followed a few steps, stopping again when the distance felt too great. "Mister," he called, not loud, but enough, and Caleb paused this time, just once, turning his head slightly, not fully, just enough to listen. "If someone remembers you," the boy said, struggling to shape the thought, "does that make you important?" And Caleb stood there. For a moment, the question settling between them like dust that refused to rise, and when he answered, his voice carried something softer than before, not tired, not distant, just clear. "It means you were there when it mattered," he said, and the boy nodded slowly, though he did not fully understand, because understanding something like that did not come all at once. It came later, in moments that looked nothing like this one. Behind them, the last of the riders disappeared beyond the edge of town, their presence fading into the same quiet they had arrived from, leaving nothing behind but the echo of what had been shown, and even that began to settle into memory. Caleb turned forward again and continued walking, his steps steady, unhurried, as if the road ahead had always been waiting for him, and the town, for all its noise and certainty, had only ever been a place he passed through. The saloon door remained open behind him, the man in the doorway no longer blocking it, no longer deciding who belonged, and for the first time, it looked like a place instead of a barrier. The sheriff exhaled slowly, a breath he had been holding without realizing it, and rested his hands at his sides, because whatever authority he had believed in had been reshaped into something quieter, something that required less speaking and more seeing. The boy stood still, watching Caleb disappear down the road, the question still turning in his mind, not finished, not resolved, but planted, and sometimes that was enough. And out there, where the road stretched beyond the town and the dust settled back into its place, Caleb adjusted his hat one last time, the feather inside unseen again, not because it had lost its meaning, but because it had already done what it was meant to do, and in the silence that followed, the kind that comes after something true has been recognized, the world felt just a little more honest than it had before. The road stretched out ahead of him in a long pale line, fading into the kind of distance that swallowed names and left only footsteps behind. And Caleb walked it the same way he had walked 100 others, steady, unhurried, like a man who did not expect the road to remember him either. The sun dipped lower, turning the dust into something softer, gold instead of red, and the town behind him began to shrink, not just in size, but in weight, like whatever it had been holding no longer belonged to him. A breeze moved across the open land, light but constant, brushing against his coat, slipping under the brim of his hat, and for a moment, it caught that hidden feather again, lifting it just enough to remind him it was still there, still carrying something he had never put into words. He slowed once, just once, when the sound of hooves came faint behind him, not urgent, not chasing, just following at a distance that respected the space he had chosen, and he did not turn right away, because he already knew who it would be, not by sound, but by the way the air shifted again, familiar now in a way that did not need explanation. The rider approached at a walk, closing the distance slowly, and when Caleb finally turned his head, it was not with surprise, just acknowledgement, and there, a few yards back, the chief sat tall in the saddle, alone this time, the rest of his people long gone beyond the ridge, leaving only the two of them on that stretch of open ground. Neither spoke at first, because the silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had already been said without words, and the horse beneath the chief shifted slightly, breathing slow, as if even the animal understood that this was not a moment to rush. Caleb stopped then, turning fully now, boots settling into the dust, his hand resting lightly on the brim of his hat, not holding it, not hiding it, just there, as it had always been. The chief studied him for a moment, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, the way a man looks at something he has already decided to trust, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same quiet weight as before. "You left before the fire burned down," he said, and the words seemed to reach backward instead of forward, touching something that lived somewhere between memory and regret. Caleb's eyes shifted slightly, not away, but deeper, like he was measuring how much of that past belonged in this moment. "It was not my place to stay," he answered, simple, and the chief nodded once, because that answer held more truth than anything longer would have. The wind moved again, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant water, and for a brief second, the world felt wider than the space between them, like both men were standing inside something much larger than either of their stories. "He asks about you," the chief said then, and there was a softness in his voice that had not been there before, something closer to family than leadership. And Caleb's hand tightened just slightly on the brim of his hat, not enough to show, but enough to feel. "He is strong," Caleb replied, not asking, not needing to hear it, just stating what he had already chosen to believe. And the chief's expression shifted again, not into a smile, but into something warmer, something that carried gratitude without needing to show it openly. The silence returned, but it was different now, not heavy, not waiting, just settled, like the ground after rain. And the chief gave a small nod, the kind that did not ask for anything in return, then turned his horse slightly, preparing to leave the same way he had come, without spectacle, without announcement. Caleb watched him for a moment, then lifted his hand just enough to touch the brim of his hat, not removing it, not repeating what had already been done, just a quiet acknowledgement that did not belong to anyone else. And the chief saw it, understanding it for exactly what it was. Then he rode on, the sound of hooves fading slowly into the distance until it became part of the wind again, and Caleb stood there for a moment longer, alone once more, but not the same kind of alone as before, because some things, once remembered, do not leave a man empty. They leave him steady, and when he turned back to the road and continued walking, the dust rose beneath his boots just the same, but the silence around him felt different now, like it was carrying his name even if no one spoke it. The road bent slightly west as the light thinned, turning the sky into a pale wash of copper and dust, and Caleb kept walking until the town behind him became nothing more than a suggestion on the horizon, a place that had already begun to forget the sound of its own lesson. The land opened wide here, flat and honest, broken only by scrub and the occasional fence post leaning like it had grown tired of standing straight. And in that openness, a man either felt small or he felt clear, and Caleb had learned long ago which one he preferred. He slowed near a shallow rise where the ground dipped toward a dry creek bed, the kind that only remembered water when the season was right, and he stepped down into it, boots crunching lightly on gravel, the sound carrying farther than it should. In the quiet, he crouched there for a moment, brushing his fingers along the earth, not searching for anything, just touching something that did not ask questions, and when he stood again, he removed his hat, turning it once in his hands, the feather sliding into view with the last of the daylight catching its edge. It was worn, yes, but not fragile, the kind of thing that lasted because it had been kept, not displayed. And he studied it the way a man studies a promise he has already kept, not to prove it, but to remember why it mattered. A faint echo of water moved through his thoughts, not loud, not detailed, just enough to bring back the weight of a smaller figure in his arms, the pull of a current that had not cared who either of them were, and the quiet decision made without witness, without need for one, because some choices were not about being seen, they were about being right. He slid the feather back into the band and set the hat on his head again, pulling it down just enough to block the last of the glare, and for a moment he stood still, listening to the wind move across the land, carrying nothing but itself, and it felt enough. A rider's silhouette appeared far off along the ridge, too distant to make out clearly, just a shape against the fading sky, and Caleb did not tense, did not reach for anything. He simply watched, because not every figure on the horizon meant trouble. Some just meant the world was still moving the way it always had. The rider paused, just for a second, then turned away, disappearing beyond the line of land as quietly as it had come, and Caleb nodded once, to no one in particular, as if acknowledging that. Not every path had to cross again to remain understood. The air cooled as the sun slipped lower, and the colors of the day softened into something quieter, less demanding, and Caleb stepped out of the creek bed and back onto the road, his shadow stretching long ahead of him like it was leading the way instead of following. He walked on without looking back, not because there was nothing behind him, but because what mattered there had already been settled, and the rest would take care of itself. In time, carried in the way people spoke a little softer, watched a little closer, and remembered a little longer. Out here, where the land did not care who you were until you showed it, a man could keep his name to himself and still be known, not by the noise he made, but by the moments he chose to stand when it counted. And as the last light faded and the first hint of night settled in, Caleb's steps remained steady, measured, like a man who did not need the road to tell him where he belonged, because he had already answered that question somewhere far from any town, in a place where no one had been watching, but someone had remembered. Night came the way it always did out here, not all at once, but in quiet layers, the last color draining from the sky, while the land held on to its warmth just a little longer, and Caleb walked through it like he belonged to that rhythm, not rushing, not lingering, just moving forward the way a man does when he has already made peace with where he has been. The road narrowed into little more than a trail now, the kind that did not promise anything except distance, and the only sound left was the steady crunch of his boots and the wind brushing low across the ground, whispering through dry grass like it carried stories it would never repeat the same way twice. He slowed near a lone fence post, weathered and leaning, its wire long gone, nothing left but a marker of where something used to be, and he rested his hand on it for a moment, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingers, the kind of texture that reminded a man how long things could stand if they were left alone long enough. He removed his hat again, not because he needed to, but because something about the quiet asked for it, and he turned it slowly in his hands, the feather catching the faint light of a rising moon now, pale and steady, nothing like the sun that had judged him earlier in the day. This light did not measure, it simply revealed what was already there. His eyes lingered on the feather for a moment longer than before, not searching, not questioning, just remembering, and then he slid it back into place and set the hat down firmly on his head, settling it like a man closing a chapter without needing to read it again. Far behind him, though he could no longer see it, the town had already begun to change in small ways that no one would speak about directly. The saloon door would not feel the same to the man who stood there. The sheriff would think twice before deciding who belonged, and a boy would carry a quiet question into the years ahead, one that would shape the way he looked at men who said nothing but meant everything. Caleb did not need to witness any of that, because the kind of change that mattered did not require a man to stand there and watch it grow. It only needed to be planted, and then it would find its own way. The wind picked up slightly, cooler now, carrying the scent of distant water somewhere beyond the hills, and Caleb lifted his gaze just enough to follow that direction, not because he planned to go there, but because it reminded him that the world was larger than any place that tried to define him. He took another step, then another, his shadow now swallowed by the night, leaving only the sound of movement and the presence of a man who did not need to be seen to be known. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then again, and the land answered with silence, the kind that did not feel empty, but full, like it was holding everything it needed without asking for more. Caleb kept walking into that quiet, his pace unchanged, his path his own, and, though no one followed, no one called his name, the weight of what had been remembered walked with him, not as a burden, but as something steady, something earned without ever being claimed. And out here, where the land did not care for titles or voices, where a man's worth was not written on a sign or spoken in a room, it lived in moments like that one back in the dust, when no one believed in him. And still, he stood, and someone else remembered, because out here, a man does not become somebody when the world finally sees him. He becomes somebody the moment he chooses to do what is right, even when no one is watching, and whether the world ever speaks his name again does not change that truth, not out here, not ever.